Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast. Jurgen Klopp has a new job, but it's not in management. So how did a football romantic end up working for one of the world's biggest corporations? I'm joined by the Athletic's German football correspondent, Seb Stafford-Bloor, and our Liverpool writer, Simon Hughes, as well. Simon, let's get into this. Let's get some detail on this move for Jurgen Klopp. You reported in your piece on The Athletic today that the co-founder of Red Bull held a meeting with Klopp all the way back in September 2022. Are we to believe that this might have been something in the workings for a little while, Simon?
I think it most certainly was. I mean, the last couple of weeks since it's become public that Jurgen Klopp has joined Red Bull, there's been a variety of Red Bull faces, notably Max Verstappen saying, I'm not sure how this sort of open secret remained a secret for so long. It is true that Jurgen Klopp met Dietrich Mateschitz, I think that's right, in just outside Salzburg, where Red Bull is based, in September 2022. He didn't agree a deal there and then, but the season before at Liverpool had been a really arduous one for the club. They'd gone close to winning a quadruple. It had been draining. Klopp had signed a new contract, but he was thinking about what comes after Liverpool. He realised that his contract would be his last. So it was an informal meeting trying to gauge where he was at and trying to understand a bit more about what Red Bull would want from him. Mateschitz died within a month. And then from there, the conversation went between his agent, Mark Kosuke, and Oliver Mitzlaff, who is the he became the CEO of investments at Red Bull. So my understanding is the deal was agreed quite some time ago, before even Klopp had decided to leave Liverpool. Yeah, I mean, it's obviously a divisive one, which I'm sure we'll get into shortly.
Leipzig, Austrian team, Salzburg, New York Red Bulls, Bragantino in Brazil, Omiya Adija in Japan, and let's not forget a small stake in Leeds United as well. That is the Red Bull Sports Group, right? Jurgen Klopp is going to be head of global soccer. Does this mean he's going to be traveling across the world as head of global soccer, or is it much lighter than that, his role?
No, there's certainly going to be a lot of travel. And in the beginning, as I understand it, Klopp's focus is going to be on the new edition in Japan. So back in the summer, the club bought Amaya, and they're a third league team over in Japan, and a lot of infrastructure is missing. So to become, I suppose, quote unquote, a Red Bull club, you need to sort of conform to a lot of the Red Bull methods. And in the initial year, Klopp is going to be spending a lot of time in Japan, in Brazil too, with Bragantino, as you mentioned. Beyond that, I think the broader strokes are that he's kind of a mentor-like figure, and he's not going to be someone who has a role in the day-to-day processes. He's not going to involve himself in recruitment or tactics or coaching methods, because those things are kind of set at Red Bull, certainly at Leipzig, at Salzburg, although Salzburg a little bit shaky at the moment, of course. Pep Linder's not having a great time over there. But yeah, it's going to be a kind of, he's going to be a figurehead, more of a sort of, I suppose, ambassadorial person, and someone there to add his credibility to Red Bull, potentially detoxify part of the brand in the football sense, not in the energy drink sense. And yeah, it's not going to be he's not going to have a kind of a traceable influence on how the teams actually perform on the pitch.
Okay, and from I guess a Leipzig perspective and a Red Bull perspective, from a German standpoint, Bundesliga, how has this team been accepted? I'm not sure if accepted is probably the right word, but
I
how
don't
have
think it's the right
fans
word.
reacted to the Red Bull group entering the Bundesliga, which is known as a league that has a huge fan involvement in its teams?
Yeah, with great hostility. So the cornerstone of German football is fan agency. And by that, of course, we mean the 50+1 rule, which means that ultimate control of the club remains with the supporters and remains with the original sports club. And Red Bull do not have an exemption from the 50+1 rule. They're built in a way which allows them to artificially conform to them. So instead of members who in most other clubs would have that controlling stake, you have Red Bull employees. And it's very interesting if you travel around German football on a match day, whether you're at a ground where RB are playing or not, there is usually a protest to be seen against what they represent. And I think in the abstract sense, it's interesting because yes, it's about them literally, but also Red Bull represents something that German fans are very fearful of. Their ultimate nightmare is the Premier League, where you have bad ownership, and if fans don't like it, well, what are you going to do about it? And also where a situation where commercial interest becomes more important than fan interest, becomes more important than making sure you've got cheap ticket prices, that, you know, it's a good day out for your family, that people can feel involved, and you can make sure that your team still is anchored in its region and its community. And a lot of German football clubs have that. They're very specific to their part of Germany. Red Bull is a transplant on top of a former local club. We were in the 5th tier when RB bought the license. So the response has always been negative. It will always be negative. And I think we've got to remember about German football is when something happens, the German football supporter is always trained to think, and what happens next? Because they think about dominoes. So RB is here. Now, what does that mean? What kind of precedent is that setting? Who else could come in? Who else could kind of create a sort of artificial 50+1 compliance? And so this is a never-ending issue. There will never be acceptance here for RB. And, that will never change, Jurgen Klopp or no Jurgen Klopp.
Yeah, Simon, we're going to talk about sort of how fans think about Klopp's movement in just a second. But we know that Klopp went back to both his old clubs over the summer for exhibition games. I guess, is that a PR exercise in regard to what, Seb's just been talking about? These clubs, Red Bull aren't liked, and Klopp, the football man, the purist, is going to work for this big, gigantic corporation.
I can understand why a cynical mind would arrive at that conclusion, and I would share that view maybe. But I mean, there's a few things at play here. I think RB Leipzig got promotion into the Bundesliga right after Jurgen Klopp had left Borussia Dortmund. Now, that's not to say that he is unaware of the human feeling and the country that he comes from about RB Leipzig, and there was a big pushback from Dortmund fans in that year, 2016, when Klopp was Liverpool's manager. But from afar, Klopp had become an admirer of the sort of the method in the Red Bull stable, and over quite a long period of time, he spoke very well about what they were doing, at Liverpool. Although I don't think anybody was really paying that much attention. It would seem. I mean, I think they signed 4 or 5 players during his time at Liverpool from Red Bull. He liked a lot of the players that came from that environment, because all the teams play, high pressing football, high energy football. And he spoke endearingly about the setup there only a month or so before he actually met Mateschitz as well. He went on record talking about how how the way they bought players and managed them was very similar to what he did at Liverpool. So quite clearly, he wasn't afraid to sort of speak his mind when he wasn't directly connected with them. He also did an interview actually with Red Bull. I think it's Red Bull TV. I might be wrong, or the in-house media channel, about Ibrahim Konate and who else? Who was the other player? I think it was before Dominic Szoboszlai arrived at Liverpool. But speaking about what a sort of great player Konate was, so there was obviously a cooperation between him and Leipzig before he'd even gone into Red Bull. But nevertheless, I think he should, a man who has been sort of styled as this sort of opposer of new money, a defender of tradition. I can understand why people are surprised by the decision. I can. I'm not particularly surprised because obviously I haven't covered Liverpool for a long period of time. It's quite clear that the Klopp is aware of his own self-worth, given the number of endorsements that he works or companies that he works with. He probably, I would imagine, thinks that he'll ride this out, become the manager of the German national team at some point, and then everybody will like him again. But I think that overlooks one basic reality is that a lot of fans, particularly at his former clubs, particularly Borussia Dortmund, don't feel that strongly about the German national team as they do about Borussia Dortmund. So I think some people will find this, particularly in Germany, quite hard to shake.
Yeah, for sure. Seb, bring us up to speed then to what the reactions have been from his former clubs, Mainz, Dortmund, for instance, who he did great stuff for at disappointment.
Characterize it as betrayal, really. I don't want to fall into the trap of conflating ultra response with average fan response because, ultra spanner is the most visible part of a football ground, of course. But a lot of the response in local media as well has been absolutely damning. And one of the themes that keeps coming up and is actually something that you see in the banners displayed during games is this idea that it's an act of hypocrisy. Klopp was always someone who presented himself as a fan ally. For instance, when he left Mainz and when he joined Dortmund, one of the first things he did in that initial summer was he met heads of fan groups and talked to them about what was important to them. What do they want their Dortmund team to be? There's a really good passage about this in Raphael Honigstein's book, Bring the Noise, where he covers that period of Klopp's career. It's very, very interesting. And so what you've seen is both in Dortmund and at Mainz is you've seen people saying things, and I'm paraphrasing here, but saying you kind of turned into everything that you promised you wouldn't, or that you stood against initially. So I mean, I'm still a bit shocked, actually. I remember waking up to the story and thinking, what a strange situation, because this is all entirely predictable. So I mentioned earlier that there's no way Jurgen Klopp could have not understood this dynamic. Like, Red Bull were promoted after he left Dortmund, yeah, but Red Bull as a phenomenon, as a kind of a cultural affront in the eyes of many people, they existed for years before that. Their start point was 2009. So Klopp knew exactly what he was walking into, and Klopp would have known exactly the response that he was getting into here. And I think for a lot of people, it's also, here's someone that could have any management job in the world should he want one. Like, he could pretty much pick his landing spot after Liverpool, and he's decided instead to kind of just to invite such negativity. It's extraordinary. So I think some people are still processing it. And Sai's right, like, his advertising presence is amazing. Like, there are adverts where he's stood on a beach looking wistfully out to sea, promoting financial management companies. He's doing white beer and gym equipment, and he's got men's skincare ranges. Like, he's pretty much the only character in German advertising on weekends, like between the advertising breaks between halftime or full time. And so it's like you put all of that in jeopardy for what? It's a really hard thing to understand.
Yeah, it reminds me of Jordan Henderson. When he obviously
100%.
With the Saudi move.
Yeah, with the Saudi move, it's like, Jordan had stood for one thing and then did something totally opposite. And I do wonder whether, I think in the UK, people aren't that bothered, if I'm being honest. Obviously, sort of rival fans of Liverpool will always think, well, Jurgen Klopp is a bad man anyway. And Liverpool fans will defend him. But certainly in Germany, I don't know how he salvages his reputation. People feel that strongly about ownership, and I think the right to. I just don't. I can almost understand Jordan Henderson more, because I think he was expecting to stay at Liverpool, to be told, no, you can actually go. And in that moment, sort of lost his head. Whereas Klopp has had a big run up to this. As I say, his agent, Mark Koskett, very smart fella, I would say, and sort of understands the way of the world. But he's got a good relationship with Oliver Mitzlaff. What's the CEO's name? I keep on getting his surname wrong.
Mintzlaff,
Mintzlaff, yeah, thank you. Yeah. And I just can't believe they'd be blinded by all this, but it seems that they have, and they've totally misjudged the mood. So I think in the UK, people would feel more strongly about it if, say, suddenly Leeds became Red Bull Leeds, and where that is then going to lead, and the same conversation will start happening. But for the time being, it seems like the conversation just isn't quite as aggressive in the UK. I sense it in Germany, speaking to quite a few people over the last 10 days, that there's real sense of betrayal there.
It's really interesting because in the UK, obviously, like when I moved over a couple of years, and it took me a while to really appreciate the RB thing. When you're talking about a commercial entity owning a football club, it's kind of small fry by comparison, and there's a real temptation to think, what's the fuss? But then if you simplify it and you draw a divide in German football between the forces that protect fan agency in football and the forces that are perceived to be against it, what you have here is Klopp kind of crossing over that line in the eyes of many people. And that's kind of the dynamic that he's invited, which he's not an idiot. He's an extremely smart person, an extremely good communicator. He knew what he was doing. And so it's very interesting in the kind of dispassionate sense, but it's crazy.
Yeah, for sure. Well, of course, Liverpool play one of Klopp's potential new clubs, RB Leipzig, in the Champions League. And Seb, I'm just fascinated from a Red Bull perspective and a footballing sense, more in particular. What is the ultimate ambition of Red Bull? Because Leipzig are doing pretty well. And I remember you tipping them actually this season to do some interesting things. What is the ultimate ambition? Is it to win the Bundesliga, for instance, in Germany? Is it to have a conglomerate of teams that are literally at the top, almost like the City Group?
Yeah, so I think RB Leipzig will always be at the apex of this food chain. That's the idea. Currently, the aim is, I mean, there's a desire to win the Bundesliga. The aim is not to do that because I think the way, if the difference between a club like RB and Bayer Leverkusen, for instance, is like last summer, Leverkusen went out, they bought Granit Xhaka, Alex Grimaldo, Jonas Hoffman, right? These are the players who emotionally anchor a team. RB don't do that because their business model at the moment is to identify talent, buy young talent, and be the stepping stone to the top of the game. So I would say someone like Josko Gvardiol is a great example. Dominik Szoboszlai is a great example. Ibrahim Konate, the perfect example. That's who Red Bull want to be. And so that is more important at the moment than winning the league. But over time, I was actually having a conversation with someone at the club yesterday, and there was no timeline attached to this, but they said eventually the idea will be to change that a little bit so that there can be a little bit more focus on achievement. They want to finish in the top four, and I think they have a very, very good chance of winning the league this season. They are so talented. But yeah, the club isn't necessarily designed for ultimate success right now. It's going to be interesting to see how that changes and also how quickly that changes, because at some point you've got to find the ratios, right? Because you probably can't build a title winning side out of 11 Javi Simons because they're growing. He's going to be a wonderful player, and there are games when he is already one, but he doesn't necessarily have the experience of a 30-year-old veteran who's been around European football and knows kind of how to navigate its difficult moments, all these kind of things. So that will happen at some point, just not yet.
I guess what I'm interested in from what Seb's just said is then what constitutes a success for Klopp at Red Bull, right? You're bringing in, with all due respect, though, whether or not they've got the Bundesliga in sight or whatever, you've brought in someone who's won the Champions League. You've brought in someone who's won multiple, league titles domestically. That should signal a sense of ambition, surely.
It should, but if you listen to sort of the people who used to fill that role, so in the past, I think one of the first people to have this head of global soccer titles was Gerard Houllier, and I remember speaking to him 2015 about it, and I almost sensed that he was almost trying too hard to stress how important the role was. And when I spoke to other people, it was like, well, he's just sort of an ambassador, going around shaking people's hands and signing off, sponsorship deals and whatever else. And then Ralf Rangnick took that role on from 2019 when RB Leipzig decided they didn't really want him as manager anymore. And the attitude was, yeah, go to Brazil, go to New York. It's going to be great. Everyone's going to really appreciate your presence there. And the reality was he went there, would whisper in some of the coaches' ears and tell them, what they could do better, blah, blah, blah. he wanted to play a meaningful role in this and took it seriously, but came away just feeling really that everybody at those clubs in those different parts of the world realised that he'd come, then he'd go away, and things would just go back to normal. So really, I mean, how much impact Klopp can have, I just think it's a, it gives out the Red Bull conglomeration a degree of legitimacy that didn't exist there before. I think that's potentially already worked for them for a very relatively small amount of money. In terms of actually improving the sporting context around it, I think it would take a long. It would. His contract is not that long, right? I mean, I think it is 18 months, Seb. That's not long enough to change things. I mean, it took him how many years to win a trophy at Liverpool? It took him 4 years to win a trophy at Liverpool. Hit by his own recognition, it takes time to improve things. Now, obviously, the system at Red Bull is already very well respected by people who know about football. And as Seb said, that they are doing well at various clubs. So he might be able to do something that just gives them that little bit of edge, but it's very difficult to see how. It ultimately comes down to the manager and the players, doesn't it? Each of those clubs. It just sounds to me like a little bit of the role is a bit of a horse whisperer, really, going in, giving people a little bit of pep talks, and then going back and having nice holidays here and there.
I mean, it's not a bad life, Simon. Come on.
It sounds like a great job. It sounds like
it's
a great
not a
job.
bad job. Decent money in the pocket, and you don't really have to stretch yourself so far. I mean, come on.
No, I could understand why anybody else would take it, but from Jurgen Klopp's perspective, I think he's just got a lot more to lose by taking that job. I mean, Daniel Farke said a few weeks ago, the Leeds manager, who, despite being German, didn't have really any prior relationship with Klopp. He revealed, well, I can pick up the phone to him anyway. All the people that he's working with at each of these clubs, he knows personally anyway. So it's not like, that. I think each of those managers, whether it's Pep Linders, Marco Rosa, who's not quite as tight with Klopp as I think some of the other managers, the manager in New York City, they all know him anyway. So, maybe he reinforces certainly it's useful for Linders at this moment in time, as Seb said, that Salzburg aren't doing particularly well. So it's useful that he's got a friend at a reasonably high level at the club who can just say, let's just be patient with this guy. Let's not sack him. Because they've been hammered a few times. They've not just been beaten; they've been absolutely hammered. So he needs some support at a senior level at Red Bull, I would say, just to calm things down a little bit. But in terms of a real impact at a number of places, particularly when we're talking about Japan, right? This club is going to need a lot of focus to get everything right. I just wonder how much time he can devote to all these different projects. I mean, the other thing is there was a big stress on the PR element from Red Bull about Klopp around recruitment. Well, you're not telling me that he knows the Japanese league. You're not telling me that he knows Brazil and what's right for the Brazilian culture and the club there. I think he could be very useful to Red Bull Leipzig and potentially useful to Salzburg. But beyond that, it's beyond his field of interest, I would say, in terms of the surrounding landscape. So it is a learning lesson for him as well. I mean, I think he could learn things from an executive level as well. I think sometimes at Liverpool, he found hard relating to sort of business people at different elements of the club. I think this will give him that experience and set him up. I mean, he could go into the German national team role with a better level of experience and more rounded experience for him. I think it could work for him, and I can understand why he would think that.
Yeah, I want to touch on that later, but Seb, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything Si says absolutely right. I think there's so much for Klopp to gain from viewing the game from this different perspective, but also with RB Leipzig, it's difficult to know what he can contribute, because you might say, well, in the mind of a British fan or someone from outside Germany, Dortmund remain the head of the class in terms of recruitment. And that's a really out of date perception. I would say that now RB Leipzig are what Dortmund used to be. So if you go back maybe 5-10 years, a player like Lois Openda, Benjamin Šeško, Antonio Nusa, these players are probably being recruited by Dortmund. And now, I mean, it's very hard to pick a hole in Leipzig's transfer policy. Their record is absolutely excellent. Their current group of players is really, really strong. You can see probably 4 or 5 players who will end up at the very top of the game currently in their first team, who's still developing. So in that sense, there's not much for Klopp to, he can't really bring best practice from Dortmund because it feels like Leipzig have already copied and surpassed what they used to do. And I wonder, I'm guessing, but I wonder whether that's not part of the resentment. Yes, Klopp, the person going to Leipzig is very, very jarring, but also Dortmund are going through a very difficult period in terms of their identity. Like on the pitch, things don't seem to be dramatically bad, but a Champions League final is obviously a good thing in any year. But from a stylistic perspective, they've had a couple of fallow years. There's been a lot of change coaching wise. Nuraj Sahin is, I think, the 7th coach to be employed since Klopp left the club in 2015. So you're seeing another club build, another club develop a distinct identity. Worst of all, it's a club that you sort of ideologically oppose for so many different reasons. And now Klopp's gone there too. So that's got to be extremely difficult to take.
Brilliant. Right, let's move on to Klopp at Liverpool, Simon. Just very quickly, in your piece, you quoted president of FSG, Mike Gordon, in the recently updated version of Raphael Honigstein's book, which we mentioned earlier, actually, Bring the Noise. Gordon said the burden of leading Liverpool was wearing on Klopp. We spoke about this in a previous pod, but just how difficult, just bring us back, was that final year for Jurgen Klopp, and just how exhausted was he from day-to-day running of a football club?
Well, I think you've got to roll it back to that, to really the year he won the title, and I saw a big difference in him, albeit from a distance from that moment. Liverpool win the Champions League, they win the league in the pandemic. They obviously try and defend their title without any crowds. Klopp going through some quite challenging personal issues. I know his mother died back in Germany, couldn't go to the funeral. Liverpool not doing particularly well, get into the Champions League, nearly miss out on it. And then they go on this incredible season where, they almost win the quadruple. The players are exhausted. There is a massive need for change. He's finding it difficult to let go of some of the players. Some of the players feel a bit let down by him because of the way he handles it. And then this is when he obviously first meets Red Bull, right? So, and since then, Liverpool have had, they fell out of the Champions League, some bad defeats. Obviously, last season they went close again. It seemed like it was going to be a promising season, but ultimately, the team wasn't quite experienced enough, I think, to get over the line in the big competitions. And I think, towards the end, the way Klopp left, he seemed very prickly in the media. Obviously, we saw his public fallout with Mohamed Salah, which if somebody had predicted that at some point 3 or 4 years earlier, you just wouldn't have believed it. So I think that the person that we saw in front of the cameras was largely the person who was operating behind the scenes as well. It was draining, and the reality is managing Liverpool, it's not just a football job. It's without sounding too romantic or overblown about it, it's a civic job as well. The people in the city of Liverpool expect, say, a Liverpool manager to act a certain way and be a spokesman, not just for the football club, but for the actual city itself. And I would argue as well, where I have sympathy with them, I think the FSG have been responsible owners of Liverpool, but Jurgen Klopp became the front man of the club. He became the spokesman, as I say. He had to speak about everything. You never hear from FSG about anything at all. It was all layered onto Jurgen Klopp's responsibilities. Mike Gordon obviously spoke to Rafa Honigstein in his book. Mike Gordon is the president of FSG. He never speaks publicly about anything. We only hear from John Henry when he's apologising for some ridiculous plan that he's conceived in his own head that sounds great. in front of a fireplace. So all these FSG people, yes, I think there's things can be good and they can be bad. I think they've run the club responsibly. The ground, the stadium they found a solution to the stadium problem. They've built a excellent training complex with the help of Klopp. But I still don't feel that. I feel sorry for Klopp in the sense that the whole responsibility of not just managing Liverpool, but sort of being the front face of Liverpool was all on him. He was having to answer questions all the time. So when it comes to the European Super League, Jurgen Klopp answering the questions about it, having to dismiss his owner's plans. I mean, how ridiculous is this situation? Over a long period of time, this just weighs heavily on a person's shoulders. And I think he did extraordinarily well at Liverpool, certainly the first 5 years, to heave them off the canvas and get them into a position where they were a European force again. In terms of his legacy, I'm not quite sure whether things are quite as healthy as people like to project. I think there's a lot of things that need to be solved behind the scenes at Liverpool, which Klopp partly was responsible for, because FSG allowed him to become this sort of, it became his operation rather than the FSG operation. A lot of the structures that FSG actually have put in place managed to fall away over the years, and it became a Jurgen Klopp operation. I think Arne Slot has done really well to sort of pick up the baton and quickly. Obviously, FSG have put in people return people like Michael Edwards and Julian Ward and a variety of other people. But I still think the team's still quite far away from being where it was the 2018, well, certainly 2019 to 2020 period under Klopp, where they won almost everything.
Yeah, just picking up on that, Seb. It sort of evolved into the Jurgen Klopp operation. Maybe he is suited for corporate life. Who knows? But is there a way back into management for someone like Klopp? After life at Red Bull, you think about iconic managers like that, and I wonder if Pep Guardiola might evolve into one of these people as well. Arsene Wenger notoriously really struggled to get back into management. Obviously, he's got quite an important role of FIFA, but he's still not hands-on anymore. That kind of management, especially when you're taking a club and reshaping a club, it is incredibly draining. Is there a way back for him into management after this?
There's always a way back for someone like that, given the things that he achieves and given what he represents to most people, like beyond the context that Si's just laid out at Liverpool. Like, he will at any point have whatever job he wants. Whether he wants that is a different issue altogether, because you mentioned it, like being a head coach of a team like Liverpool today, it's like being a CEO, isn't it? It's exhausting. You're part, your business leader, your coach, you're almost like a priest in different ways, right? You fulfill so many different roles. It's got to be absolutely exhausting. But your reputation is your reputation. We see now head coaches who've fallen off the previous generation, they still get jobs, same as players. There's always someone who's willing to take another chance on you, even after you've kind of denigrated your reputation, which I don't think Klopp has in the coaching sense. He is still a premium coach, like a kind of a high priest of footballing ideology that he was before. I think his ultimate destination is the German national team job, because Julian Nagelsmann's current contract runs until the 2026 World Cup. Nagelsmann will almost certainly reach the 26 World Cup just because he's unlocked kind of a new period of popularity. I think the way he connected with the German people and his emotional response to success and failure during the summer gave people an image of Nagelsmann that didn't previously exist, because before he was at Hoffenheim. No one cares about Hoffenheim. He was at RB, and there's baggage there. Like, clearly everybody recognized him as a bright young thing of the coaching world. Obviously, he's very gifted. And then Bayern Munich, which is a different challenge altogether and inspires a different sort of resentment course just because of how popular and successful they've been. Nagelsmann has really enjoyed, I think, being national hero is way too strong a phrase, but he's led a revival. Clearly, German national team football is in a better place than it was when he arrived. The response in the population has been, if you'd said a year ago that, from between 2018 and 2022, the national team's audience on domestic TV in Germany halved. there's a whole batch of issues really around that, and that's a different podcast. But during the summer, he regained all of that audience pretty much for Germany's games. And 26, the World Cup, the current coming generation of German players is extremely talented, some of whom are already in the side now, players like Jamal Musiala, of course, Alex Pavlovic. But you've also got this underlying layer of Brian Gruder or Angelo Stiller or Paul Vanna, who's a Bayern Munich player on loan at Heidenheim, who people think is going to be every bit as good as Florian Wirtz. It's a great time to be the German national team coach. But then equally, come 2026, that is also a very good time to be the German national team coach. And something that came up earlier is, I wonder what the overlap is between people who have a stake in German club football, i.e. people who are tweaked and affronted by Klopp's career move, versus people who really, really invest in the German national team come tournaments time. I don't think that is a perfect circle. For instance, my mother-in-law, massive Jurgen Klopp fan, could not possibly care less about football, wouldn't even know what time Bundesliga game kicks off, loves Jurgen Klopp. And I think there's an awful lot of people like that in Germany who just, it won't even register. Like the ultras, the day-to-day fans, yes, that will never go away. That bruise will never heal. Of course it won't. But I don't think anything that's happened over the past few weeks will change, his likelihood of working the DFB at some point, the German FA.
I'd just like to make a point about this German national team job. I'm not absolutely sure whether international management would suit Jurgen Klopp based around the football that he's most comfortable with. Over the last 4 years at Liverpool, it's been a different Liverpool to the version that Liverpool were in the first 4 or 5 years when people talk about gegenpressing and everything else that we know about Jurgen Klopp. It was more of a considered style of football, which I understand why it happened, because Liverpool suddenly became a team that was allowed possession, so they had to be better in possession. Now, national team football at the end of a season, which Jurgen Klopp has repeatedly highlighted, the players are exhausted. So is Jurgen Klopp going to be asking, I don't know, who's the German midfield who runs about a lot? Is he going to be asking those players to be going at full pelt? Are they going to be able to execute the football that he is comfortable with at international level? Not only that, if you look at international football, the teams that tend to win those tournaments, it tends to be teams that take care of the ball better, or teams that just defend really, really well. And I would argue that Jurgen Klopp at his best delivers neither of those styles of football. Now, as an outside bet, I find it interesting that he's based himself in Mallorca. He said before that he only feels comfortable managing where the power of his word can be expressed and listened to. If he's living in Mallorca, I wonder whether he's learning Spanish. I think he's always found Spanish football quite interesting, because his results against Spanish teams for Liverpool have been a bit mixed, actually. He's found it quite hard against Spanish teams. I couldn't imagine him going into Real Madrid, but a club like Barcelona that needs maybe lifting again. Who knows? No one's ever said, this is me just guessing, bit of guesswork, but there's a limitation to the roles that he could take in the future, I would say. Back in Germany, maybe go back into Dortmund, but then, obviously people might feel a bit differently about him. Could he wreck the sort of absolutely wreck everything? Could he go back in there and fail? There will be that in his head. Go to Bayern Munich, that's going to, upset a lot of people potentially. So there is a very small pool of places where he could end up. He might just decide, like other managers like Arsene Wenger, just to sail away into the distance and have a laugh on the beach somewhere. But I think he might struggle with the national team in terms of just the reality of when they play matches.
Well, I tell you what, he'll definitely be watching tonight as RB Leipzig take on Liverpool in the Champions League, hopefully sunning it up in Mallorca, as you like to say, Simon. Anyway, gents, let's leave it there. Thanks so much for your time, Seb, Simon, and also thank you all for listening. We'll be back tomorrow. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search the Athletic FC, wherever you get your podcasts from.